Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless Official 24 channel. On what was supposed to be just another ruthless chapter in Victor Newman's long history of courtroom domination, Genoa City instead witnessed the most jaw-dropping reversal of power in its modern history, a divorce hearing that detonated into a criminal reckoning the instant a single USB drive changed hands, because as the judge called the court to order and Victor sat with that familiar, unshakable confidence, the kind that comes from decades of buying outcomes, crushing enemies, and rewriting rules. No one suspected that the empire he built was about to collapse in real time, that Nikki Newman, long dismissed as the emotional party, the unstable spouse, the woman Victor believed he could discredit and destroy, was seconds away from delivering the final blow, not with a speech or a breakdown but with cold, irrefutable digital truth, the kind that doesn't blink or forget or bend to intimidation. And when Nikki's attorney calmly announced the submission of newly discovered evidence, Victor smirked, assuming it was another desperate ploy, another emotional Hail Mary, until Summer Newman stood, crossed the aisle, and placed a small black USB drive on the evidence table, her hand steady, her eyes blazing, signaling that this was not just family drama but a coordinated takedown years in the making, because as the drive was entered into record and the first file loaded onto the courtroom monitors, the air shifted, the murmur stopped, and Victor's expression changed from smug amusement to sharp suspicion, then to barely concealed panic, as emails, audio files, and financial records flashed on screen, each one meticulously timestamped, encrypted, and authenticated, revealing a web of illegal surveillance, bribery, shell corporations, and witness tampering that tied directly back to Victor himself, not as rumors or accusations but as his own words, his own directives. His own voice ordering outcomes, destroying reputations, manipulating judges, and orchestrating payoffs to ensure Nikki's past struggles were weaponized against her in this very divorce, and with each file the judge's face hardened, the prosecution's eyes widened, and Victor's attorney visibly paled, realizing too late that this USB wasn't just divorce leverage but a criminal dossier, because buried among the files was the ultimate smoking gun. A recorded conversation where Victor explicitly admitted to falsifying evidence, coercing medical professionals, and arranging illegal financial transfers to frame Nikki as unstable and unfit, all to secure a favorable ruling, and when the judge demanded clarification, Nikki stood, her voice calm but resolute, and confirmed that the files had been independently verified, backed up, and already submitted to federal authorities, ensuring there would be no erasing this truth. No Newman cleanup crew swooping in to make it disappear, and that was the moment Victor knew. This wasn't a setback, this was the endgame, because as the judge recessed briefly to review the material, the courtroom buzzed with disbelief, with allies and enemies alike realizing they were witnessing the fall of a titan, a man who had survived kidnappings, wars, hostile takeovers, and countless scandals, now undone by the very technology he thought he controlled. And when the court reconvened, the verdict came swift and devastating, the judge ruling not only in Nikki's favor on every divorce claim, granting her the settlement, the assets, the protection orders, and full legal vindication, but also ordering Victor's immediate detainment pending criminal charges, at which point the doors opened and law enforcement entered, their presence electrifying the room, and as the handcuffs clicked around Victor Newman's wrists, Genoa City's most powerful man was reduced to stunned silence, led away under the weight of his own recorded confessions while cameras flashed and whispers spread like wildfire, because this wasn't just an arrest, it was a public execution of a legacy, and Nikki, standing tall amid the chaos, didn't gloat or collapse, she simply watched, tears in her eyes but her spine unbroken, knowing that for the first time in decades she had won not by surviving Victor but by defeating him, and as Victor was escorted out, he locked eyes with her, a mixture of rage, betrayal, and disbelief flickering across his face, silently asking how she dared, how she outplayed him, and the answer was clear to everyone watching, she dared because she finally stopped playing his game, because she trusted her children, because she let the truth speak louder than fear, and because Summer's decision to bring that USB into court transformed a divorce hearing into a historical reckoning, one that sent shockwaves through Newman Enterprises as stock prices trembled, board members panicked, and long-buried secrets threatened to surface next, because if this was what was on one drive, what else existed, what other crimes were waiting to explode? And as the courtroom emptied and Nikki was surrounded by quiet support, the headlines were already writing themselves, From Power to Prison, USB Evidence Ends Victor's Empire, the file that changed everything, and for once they weren't exaggerations, because Victor Newman, the man who believed himself untouchable, had been undone by proof, by preparation, and by the woman he underestimated most, marking not just the end of a marriage but the collapse of a reign, a reminder that even the mightiest empires fall when the truth is finally allowed into the light. Victor Newman's moment of final domination, the day he crushed Nikki once and for all, rewrote history in black and white legal language, and walked out of the courtroom with his power, his fortune, and his pride intact. Victor entered the courtroom that morning with his familiar air of icy confidence, flanked by his elite legal team, jaw tight, eyes sharp, utterly convinced that this was already over. Nikki, on the other hand, looked fragile yet defiant, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her purse, her eyes darting not toward Victor but toward the door, because deep down, she knew everything depended on one last, desperate miracle. And then it happened. The door swung open. Summer Newman walked in. And she wasn't empty-handed. The moment Summer appeared, whispers rippled through the gallery, because something about her presence felt intentional. Calculated. She wasn't there for emotional support. She wasn't there to plead or beg. She was there to end the war. In her hand was a small, unassuming USB drive, the kind no one ever pays attention to, but what it contained would obliterate Victor Newman's case, humiliate him in open court, and deliver Nikki a victory no one, not even Victor himself, saw coming. At first, Victor barely acknowledged Summer. Why would he? In his mind, Summer was irrelevant, a pawn, a bystander, another Newman child who'd fall in line when the dust settled. He smirked as proceedings began, his attorney laying out their airtight case, Nikki's past relapses, her financial dependency, her alleged instability, her supposed inability to manage assets independently. Each accusation landed like a calculated strike, and Victor watched Nikki flinch with barely concealed satisfaction. He leaned back, arms crossed, already imagining the judge ruling in his favor. But Summer wasn't watching Victor. She was watching Nikki, and when Nikki's eyes met hers, Summer gave the smallest nod. That was the signal. When Victor's attorney concluded with smug finality, certain the damage was done, Nikki's lawyer stood, and instead of calling a witness, quietly requested permission to submit new evidence. The courtroom shifted. Victor's smile faded. The judge raised an eyebrow. And that's when Summer stepped forward. Gasps echoed as Summer announced she was submitting digital evidence relevant to Victor's financial conduct, marital manipulation, and intentional concealment of assets. Victor snapped to his feet instantly, objecting, his voice thunderous, accusing Summer of theatrics, irrelevance, and outright fabrication. But the judge overruled him. The USB was accepted into evidence. And the moment it was plugged into the courtroom system, Victor Newman's empire began to crack. What played on the screen was not speculation. Not hearsay. Not emotional testimony. It was cold, brutal data, internal Newman Enterprises files, time-stamped emails, hidden accounts, shell corporations, and encrypted communications Victor had used to move marital assets beyond Nikki's legal reach. Worse still? The footage included private recordings, Victor speaking openly about keeping Nikki dependent, about waiting for her next relapse, about ensuring she would never walk away with anything substantial. The gallery erupted. Nikki froze, tears streaming silently down her face, not from weakness, but from vindication. Every cruel suspicion she'd buried deep inside her heart was now undeniable truth, displayed for the world to see. Victor's face drained of color as realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't a bluff. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a meticulously curated archive, months, maybe years, of incriminating evidence. And as Summer stood there, calm and unflinching, she revealed the final dagger. She had obtained the files legally, through corporate oversight, access Victor himself had granted her years earlier, access he'd forgotten, underestimated, and dismissed. For the first time in decades, Victor Newman was speechless. He watched as his attorney scrambled, objecting again and again, but each protest was overruled. The judge's expression hardened with every file reviewed. The narrative Victor had spent a lifetime controlling was unraveling, not behind closed doors, not through backroom deals, but in open court, in front of Nikki, their family, and Genoa City itself. Nikki finally found her voice. When she took the stand, she didn't beg. She didn't plead. She didn't crumble. She spoke with clarity, strength, and heartbreaking honesty, describing years of manipulation disguised as protection, control masked as love, and power wielded as punishment. She spoke of how Victor weaponized her struggles, how he waited for her lowest moments to assert dominance, how he used money not as partnership but as a leash. And with every word Nikki spoke, the evidence from Summer's USB corroborated it. Victor wasn't just losing the argument, he was losing the moral high ground, the legal footing, and the illusion of being the wronged party. The judge didn't need hours of deliberation. The decision was swift. Decisive. Devastating. Nikki Newman was awarded a stunning victory, a massive settlement, control over key shared assets, and legal acknowledgement of Victor's financial misconduct. The ruling echoed like a gunshot. Game over. Victor stood frozen as the gavel fell, his world collapsing in real time. He had lost. Not strategically. Not temporarily. But completely. Nikki had defeated him. And the weapon wasn't brute force or legal trickery, it was truth. Summer's truth. The truth Victor never believed would surface. As the courtroom emptied, Nikki remained seated for a moment, absorbing the weight of what had just happened. She hadn't just won a divorce. She had reclaimed her autonomy, her dignity, and her voice. Summer approached her quietly, placing the USB in Nikki's hand, a symbolic gesture, a reminder that this victory belonged to her now. Nikki pulled Summer into a fierce embrace, whispering words of gratitude through tears. This wasn't just about a marriage ending. It was about a cycle finally breaking. Victor, meanwhile, stormed out in silence, his pride in ruins, his control shattered. The whispers followed him, not admiration this time, but disbelief. The man who always won had finally been outplayed. And the irony burned deeper than any loss of money ever could. It wasn't an enemy who destroyed him. It was family. His own granddaughter. The one person he never considered a threat. Summer didn't look back as Victor disappeared down the courthouse steps. She didn't need to. The damage was done. The era of Victor Newman's untouchable dominance had officially ended, not with violence, not with vengeance, but with a single USB drive and the courage to press play. The fallout from the courtroom verdict didn't wait until sunset, it detonated the moment Nikki Newman stepped outside into the blinding flash of cameras, microphones shoved forward as reporters shouted questions about the ruling that had just rewritten Genoa City history. Nikki paused at the courthouse steps, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted higher than it had been in years. For the first time, she wasn't hiding behind Victor's shadow or bracing for his retaliation. This time, Victor had no power left to wield. When Nikki spoke, her voice was steady, measured, and unmistakably free. She didn't gloat. She didn't attack. She simply said, "Today, the truth finally mattered." That single sentence sent shockwaves through the media, because everyone knew exactly what she meant. Victor Newman's truth had finally failed him. Behind her, Summer stood quietly, watching the scene unfold with a mix of relief and disbelief. She had done it. The USB had worked. And now there was no going back. Inside the courthouse, Victor remained locked in a private conference room with his attorneys, the air thick with fury and disbelief. He paced like a caged animal, his fists clenched, his jaw tight enough to crack. He demanded answers: how the files were found, how Summer accessed them, why no one caught this before it destroyed him. But the answers only deepened his rage. The access point was legitimate. The data trail was clean. There was no procedural loophole to exploit, no technicality to overturn the ruling. For the first time in his life, Victor Newman had to confront an unthinkable reality: he had been outmaneuvered, legally and morally, by his own family. His attorney finally said the words Victor despised more than any insult: "We can't appeal this without making it worse." That was the moment something dark settled behind Victor's eyes. He didn't respond. He didn't explode. He simply went silent, and anyone who knew Victor Newman understood that silence was far more dangerous than rage. Meanwhile, Nikki returned home to a house that suddenly felt different, lighter, quieter, as though the walls themselves had exhaled. For years, every room had carried Victor's presence, his control, his rules. Now, Nikki walked through the living room touching furniture like it was new, like it finally belonged to her. She sank onto the sofa and let the weight of the day hit her all at once. The tears came then, not of sorrow, but release. Years of fear, guilt, and self-doubt poured out in silent sobs. Summer joined her, sitting close, and Nikki reached for her hand, gripping it tightly as if afraid the moment might vanish. "You saved me," Nikki whispered, her voice breaking. Summer shook her head, eyes glistening. "No," she said softly. "You saved yourself. I just made sure people listened." That truth hit Nikki harder than the verdict itself, because she realized this victory wasn't just about evidence. It was about finally believing she deserved more. Word of Victor's defeat spread through Genoa City like wildfire. At Crimson Lights, conversations stopped mid-sentence as patrons stared at breaking news alerts flashing across their phones. At Newman Enterprises, executives exchanged uneasy glances, suddenly unsure of the future leadership dynamics. Victor had always been the immovable force, the man who could bend reality through sheer will. But now, cracks had formed. Employees whispered about audits, investigations, and whether more secrets were buried inside the company's digital skeletons. Summer's USB had done more than win a divorce case, it had exposed a vulnerability no one knew existed. And the most unsettling question of all loomed large: what else might be hiding in Victor Newman's empire? Victoria Newman watched the news coverage from her office, her expression unreadable. She had known her father was ruthless, manipulative, capable of emotional warfare, but seeing the evidence laid bare shook even her. This wasn't strategy. This was cruelty. And worse, it was reckless. Victor had endangered the company, the family name, and their future. When Victor finally arrived at Newman Enterprises later that evening, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Conversation stopped. Eyes dropped. Power still clung to him, but not unquestioned power. Victoria confronted him privately, her voice sharp, demanding to know if more damaging material existed. Victor dismissed her concerns with a cold glare, insisting this was a personal matter blown out of proportion. But Victoria wasn't convinced. She saw what others now saw, a man who had underestimated the cost of control. And for the first time, Victoria wondered if protecting the company might mean protecting it from Victor himself. As night fell, Nikki received a visit she hadn't expected: Jack Abbott. He didn't arrive with champagne or smug remarks. He arrived with quiet respect. Jack told Nikki he was proud of her, not for defeating Victor, but for surviving him. Their history hung unspoken between them, complicated and unresolved, but the moment was sincere. Jack admitted that for years, he'd believed Victor's power was unbreakable. "You proved it isn't," he said simply. Nikki smiled faintly, knowing the significance of those words. Victor Newman had built his legend on intimidation and inevitability, and now, that legend had a crack visible to everyone. When Jack left, Nikki stood by the window watching the city lights, realizing that this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, one that scared her almost as much as it excited her. The fallout from Victor Newman's arrest did not end with the echo of the courtroom doors slamming shut behind him. Instead, it rippled outward like a seismic wave that cracked foundations across Genoa City, because the moment word spread that Victor had been led away in handcuffs, on divorce day, no less, the city's power structure began to unravel in real time, alliances fraying, loyalties shifting, and enemies emerging from the shadows with a hunger that had been suppressed for years. And as Nikki stepped out of the courthouse surrounded by a storm of cameras and shouted questions, her silence spoke louder than any statement she could have given, because the woman who once stumbled under Victor's shadow now walked with a steadiness that told everyone watching that this was not a fluke, not a lucky break, but a carefully earned victory born of endurance, patience, and a refusal to be erased. While inside the Newman family itself the shock registered in different ways, Nick staring At his phone in disbelief as alerts flooded in, replaying that final moment when Victor's confident posture crumpled under the weight of undeniable proof, Sharon struggling to reconcile the man she once loved with the criminal now splashed across every screen, Adam pacing like a caged animal torn between fury at the system and grudging admiration for the precision of the takedown. Because for the first time in his life Victor hadn't lost to an enemy, he'd lost to his own family's refusal to keep protecting him, and that betrayal cut deeper than any prison sentence ever could, while Summer, the unexpected catalyst, found herself both praised and condemned, hailed as brave by some and reckless by others, yet unshaken by the noise because she knew exactly what she had done and why, having spent months quietly assembling backups, cross-checking metadata, and ensuring the USB could not be discredited, because she understood something Victor never did: power doesn't come from intimidation alone, it comes from leverage that can survive scrutiny. And as federal investigators descended on Newman Enterprises within hours of the arrest, seizing servers, freezing accounts, and interviewing executives who suddenly remembered details they'd long suppressed, it became painfully clear that the USB was not the end of the story but the beginning of a much larger unmasking, one that threatened to expose decades of corruption hidden behind philanthropy and influence, because each file opened another door, each confession pulled another thread, and soon the question shifted from "how did Nikki win?" to "how much damage will Victor's crimes ultimately reveal?" A question that haunted every boardroom and penthouse associated with his name, while Victor himself, sitting in a stark holding cell stripped of his tailored suit and commanding presence, was forced to confront a reality he had spent his life denying: that his empire was built not just on ambition but on crimes that had finally been documented, archived, and weaponized against him. And as he replayed the courtroom scene in his mind, the judge's cold tone, the officer's firm grip, Nikki's unflinching gaze, he realized